Presentation today.
Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker is Kim Martin, Social Planning and Research Council of Hamilton, respecting the 2023 municipal budget. This is an in-person presentation. Just pull the microphone down. There you go. Perfect. We're all yours. Go ahead.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you. Madam Mayor and members of the General Issues Committee, my name is Kim Martin. I'm the Executive Director of the Social Planning and Research Council of Hamilton. Today I'll be speaking to three main areas in 5 minutes. I will be speaking to some of the intense challenges of the nonprofit sector. I want to highlight some Hamilton demographic data, and I also would like to offer some recommendations to advance an equity approach to budgeting, in particular with respect to the Community Enrichment Fund. The Ontario Nonprofit Network's 2022 policy report on the state of the sector during uncertain times outlines challenges which, if left unaddressed, threaten the sustainability of service organizations. Among their key findings, following a provincial survey of more than 1,500 nonprofit organizations, they found the following. The first thing that they found was that there is a demand for nonprofit services which is higher than ever before. In fact, 74% of those surveyed reported an increase in demand for services in 2022. Nonprofits are filling gaps for affordable housing, mental health, addictions programs, settlement services, and more. Second thing they noticed in their key findings was that the inflation is rapidly increasing the costs while revenues decrease. This isn't news, but for nonprofits, they are unable to increase their prices. As you know, their services are often for free, and they're unable to pass on any increased costs to their service users. 83% of those surveyed saw an increase in costs. This was especially the case for smaller nonprofit organizations. At the same time, funding levels have not increased to meet the increased demand for services. Government transfer payments agreements have also not kept up with the cost of living. Third thing, nonprofits are experiencing a relentless human resources crisis. 65% of respondents said they experienced recruitment challenges. In addition, organizations are trying to manage staff burnout, sickness, increased stress levels, and working with participants with higher mental acuities. They're dealing with wage disparity, non-competitive compensation packages, and this is coupled with increased housing and cost of living, which means that many that can no longer afford to actually work in the nonprofit sector. They're exiting the sector. Volunteers are also not returning. So this is an issue because many social services rely on volunteers for their work. And so I'd like to just shift to looking at what does our Hamilton look like today. And we looked at some recent data that was put together through Statistics Canada and our recent census. And this slide looks at the number and percentage of residents who identify with a visible minority group in the City of Hamilton. So you'll see from the slide that we have a significant growth. The first thing that you'll see is that the number of people that identify as being part of a minority group is 25% of our population. So in 2016, we were looking at 19%, and now we're looking at 25%, which is a significant increase. That's a 40,000, roughly, a little over 40,000 more people than we had 5 years ago. You'll also see in this slide that we have a significant growth of South Asian, Black, and Arab communities in Hamilton. Why is this important? Newcomers really have unique needs and are often rely on social service systems to navigate and to acclimate to life in Canada. And it is the social service network, our nonprofit network, which really is the backbone of support for these groups that are coming into our city. As the racial makeup of our community changes, we need to ensure that we adequately fund organizations to meet those growing needs. This cannot be accomplished without increased investment. Very briefly, this next slide looks at population in terms of breakdown based on age. The thing that I'll highlight for you is the growing percentage of people over the age of 65, but also if you're looking at the 5.4% in that bottom right-hand quarter of people 85 and older, that is a demographic that is rapidly increasing nationally and one that we need to pay attention to. So, in my 23 seconds, the City Enrichment Fund is one of the main sources of funding for Hamilton nonprofits, and as such plays a critical role in holding up our service sector. Yet funding levels have not increased to reflect the day-to-day barriers facing the sector. We believe an improved model would include inflationary increases, such as that occurs in other city budget line items. We call on Council to utilize available data to help assess equity needs, and we also ask Council to place weighted emphasis on organizations serving our growing populations in need. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions of our guest? Councillor Nan, please.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. Thank you so much for coming in for your presentation today and delegation today. I was wondering if you could, in terms of that 25% increase that you've helped illustrate to all of committee in terms of the increase of population of those who identify as visible minorities. Can you speak a little bit about what that means? I think the slide does do that, but just go a little bit slower and help connect the dots between that changing demographic and the need to integrate equity as it relates to not just the not-for-profit serving sector, but overall, if there was anything else that you wanted to say about the city's budgeting priorities.
Thank you. Kim, please.
Through you, Chair. Absolutely, because our community is changing, it's shifting, and it's growing. This is an area that is growing significantly for us, and so we need to be able to meet the needs of all members of our community, and that means taking an equity approach to how we allocate funding, and looking at populations that maybe historically and proportionately have not been served in terms of our funding models. I'm hoping that helps a little bit.
Thank you, Kim.
It does.
Councillor?
Through you, Chair, in terms of the last slide, you had mentioned the necessity for helping, it's more than just document the data of the needs, but in terms of pivoting our priorities so that we are able to meet those needs, anything that you can add there in terms of not just the data-driven side of it, but how do we get to a clearer picture as a municipality around our capacity to address those needs as they've shifted, but also at the same time addressing the historical under-investing in those groups as well.
Thank you. Councillor Kim, please.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. I think that it really starts with us, first of all, accepting the data that is there and looking to make our decisions based on the data that is before us. I think it's very important for us to look at organizations that are primarily serving these groups that are in need, and looking at funding models that can help them. By one example, I can certainly say I know that with the City Enrichment Fund that there is a maximum amount that an organization can apply, which is 30% of their existing budget. Now, if you're a larger organization, 30% of your budget is probably a healthy amount to ask for from the city. But if you're a small organization, 30% of a $50,000 budget is not very much to ask for with that City Enrichment Fund. And those tend to be the organizations that are smaller. They may be more likely to be led by racialized leaders and serving racialized communities. So it's almost like the smaller organizations have a higher slope to climb when it comes to accessing the City Enrichment Fund. And that's something that we need to look at when we look at equity and when we look at true inclusion in our budgetary process.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, last question, just because I want to dig one more time on this one. And that is that last point that you mentioned in terms of those organizations that are smaller organizations serving larger and growing population need than being structurally set up to receive smaller proportions of payment. Any advice or thoughts or recommendations from you in the sector as an expert in terms of how to tier that?
Thank you. Kim, please.
Through the chair, I would say that when it comes to those formulas are useful, and we also sometimes need to throw them out the window for where it doesn't fit.
Yeah.
And that is clearly what's happening with our smaller organizations. So perhaps you want to look at a system that would look at, if your revenue is under 200,000, then this will be the threshold that, it won't be 30% in terms of what you can apply for. It would be something different. So I really think that you need to listen to the voices, particularly of those organizations that are smaller, that are serving these populations that are growing, to really ask them and consult with them in terms of what are the barriers and how can we do this better.
Thank you, Chair. Those are my...
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wang, I apologize. I saw Councillor Nan out of my corner of my eye, and I didn't know the clerk had notified you. So please proceed.
No worries. Thank you, Chair. Hi. Thank you, Kim, for your presentation. So along the same lines as what Councillor Nan has been asking you, if we were to explore, I would like to see your opinion on whether you think the City Enrichment Fund is even the right fund for what you're saying.
Kim?
Through the chair, I think that some of the data that we have, that the city already has, is that you already see that we have many more organizations applying to this fund than the city has been able to fund. And so perhaps we get to a point where we recognize that these services, these are services that are entrenched into the fabric of our social service network in Hamilton. And so to be applying every year might not be the best use of our resources. We might want to look at different models with respect to that as well, because it is so entrenched. And I don't know what the original intention of the City Enrichment Fund was when it was originally created. But these certainly aren't one-time applications. These are representing decades, sometimes, of very necessary funding.
Excellent.
Councillor?
Thank you. And through you, Chair, I think that where I'd like to try and tease out too is that in your opinion, does it make sense for us to be exploring alternative methods and alternative funds specifically to help with organizations like SPRC, other organizations? In your opinion, what do you think? Blue sky. Let's talk about blue sky. What does that look like?
Yes,
Kim?
Through the chair, absolutely. Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Alex Wilson, please.
Thank you. Through the chair, following up on these questions, one of the things I heard was the disproportionate barriers that smaller groups, often run by Black, Indigenous organizers, are facing. I've heard the same in my community, heard the same from arts organizations. Are there some standard things that groups need to apply for funding, whether it's through the city or through other grants, that may also be part of this support process? So, a low-cost auditor is one thing that's been flagged with me. Are there other barriers that groups have been reaching out to you that aren't just the financial, but help with the application side of things as well?
Thank you, Councillor. Kim?
Through you, Chair. Certainly having a simplified process is very much appreciated by grant writers and fund people that are looking for funds. So having a process that is not excessively time-consuming is important. Some of our organizations are not registered charities, so they may need to pair with another organization to access those funding. So looking at reducing some of those barriers. Certainly SPRC has been an organization that is often paired with organizations that have not had charitable status to assist them, with various applications to funding. But again, that may also impact the charities' ability to seek funding themselves. And so, really looking at that system, I think holistically, is going to be very important moving forward.
Thank you. Councillor, supplemental? Thank you, Kim, very much for your presentation.